to the show, Lon. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Ryan. How are you?
Very good. I like this song. I still have it playing in the background. I know you can't hear it. You've got an assortment of CDs, don't you? You've done a lot of music as well as writing.
Yes. Well, I just sort of write, and sometimes that's books, and sometimes it's music, sometimes it's screenplays. But the last few years, last 5 or 6 years, I really picked up the songwriting end of things again. That's what I did when I was a younger man, and I've been enjoying myself musically, and but it's all just sort of just another outlet for whatever my creative juices that need to flow.
Are all the songs about being outside the box, stepping outside the box?
Well, in a way they are. But they're not overtly magical per se. The biggest magic in the universe is love, and a simple love song can be as profoundly, spiritual and magical as anything else that you could do to try to be magical. So I write an assortment of songs. The newest album is called Gentle Heretic, and it's a collection of some of my more edgier, and if you're too sensitive, might be offensive songs, but they're really not meant to be.
No, the truth seems to be offensive, though, Lon, to people who have this preconceived notion of what should be. They're taught what is instead of what is possible, what could be. You're put into this box from the time that you're born. You're taught what is considered to be right and wrong. And if you step outside that box, you're automatically ridiculed by reflex action by the social status quo of our society. And
that's for sure.
It prevents us from being able to truly evolve spiritually and intellectually.
Yeah, so that was a pretty good choice of my songs to play there for your bumper, because my whole life, my whole career, my whole focus has been sort of thinking outside the box, and both socially, politically, spiritually. I've just been a wild, crazy kid. Now I'm a 66-year-old wild, crazy kid.
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can you pronounce it correctly for me, or did I say it right?
Well, I like to hear it said Lon Milo Duquette.
Duquette.
Yes.
Okay, Lon Milo Duquette. I just want to get that cleared up to start out.
Well, thank you.
So also, I was reading, obviously your biography. I didn't realize this until I read your bio on a couple of different links that you had sent me. All of that, including where the listeners can get copies of your books, all available at www.thesecretteachings.info. But you're actually one of the governing officers of the Ordo Templi Orientis.
Yes, I became a member. I joined. I became interested in ceremonial magic and the works of Aleister Crowley back when I was about 23, 24 years old. And I was lucky enough to come into contact with a couple of Crowley's old students. Crowley died way back in 1947, and he just had a terrible reputation, and talk about outside the box. He was so outside the box that there was you really had to be a brave soul to get deep enough into Crowley to see what a brilliant guy he was, and he was the type of guy that if you were superstitious and frightened enough to be scared by him, then he didn't want you studying his stuff anyway. So he just cultivated a very, very sort of black magician. Kind
of a persona go ahead.
Yeah, you got it. And he cultivated that just so that that the people that were really on the ball were the only ones that actually started to kind of get him. But it's the same problem like Jung had, and it's the same problem that Nietzsche had, and things like that. And so, but I was lucky enough to bump into, come into contact with a couple of his old students that studied with him when he was alive, and they sort of disabused me of all of the nonsense that surrounds his reputation, and they were just in the process of resurrecting his occult order, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which had gotten down to just them, just a handful, maybe 6 living members left. And they
wow, just that small, huh? We've covered the OTO on the show before. We've talked a lot about magic, and I've always had a big interest in Aleister Crowley. Of course, when you have a reputation and a name known as the Beast, that kind of deters, I think, people a little bit.
Yeah, it does, and it probably always will. But the order had just gotten down to. I think at the time 6 living members, all from the old days, and so I was lucky enough to be among the first that they initiated. And as it stands now, they of course have long passed away, and as it stands now, I'm the oldest, or I'm the longest. I've been a member of the OTO longer than any other living person. Okay, I guess we can put it that way. And there's no virtue to that except I just got here because other people died.
What's the main? I guess from somebody who's in the OTO, what's the main goal of the OTO? Is it to study ancient wisdom?
Well, it is, but that's more or less a collateral perk of OTO study. It's to engage the individual in a unique, and I mean unique to each individual program of willed evolution, if you will. That's what initiation is generally. We could call it willed evolution, and so it's to engage on a program to help each individual discover what their particular will is, and then do whatever they can to help them achieve, to accomplish that will. It's sort of subtle in a way, in so much that we more or less come in with the premise that we wouldn't even be here. Each of us wouldn't even exist. We wouldn't be sitting here sucking breath if there wasn't something in the universe left undone that only we can do. And that and each individual has that one thing that they need to do, that they're here to do, that's their will to do, in the same unstoppable way that the orbit of a planet, or the trajectory of the sun, or the movement of the stars within a galaxy. We're no different than those natural monads of consciousness. And so the magic of the OTO is not so much involved with certainly not pulling rabbits out of a hat, or not cursing people, or doing spells. To do the magic of the OTO is to systematically raise our own consciousness to as high as states that we are capable of achieving within this life. And so that's basically it. And Crowley had all sorts of techniques, and and all sorts of different things, some more successful than others. But his writings are not only technically interesting, they're many of them are breathtakingly inspirational, and in my opinion, put a lot of his writings on the same level as the ecstatic Christian saints, or the Rumi, or any of the other ecstatic saints of history. So it's occupied me for the last 40 years. So.
Well, Crowley's work, I know that he wrote a lot about sex magic, and when people hear something like that, they tend to think it's pornographic. What is sex magic?
Well, a lot of people are really disappointed when it's not like that.
Yeah.
Like the Tom Cruise movie, Eyes Wide Shut. They think, oh boy, I'm going to join the OTO, and it's sex magic and stuff. No, it's not pornographic unless your own personal sex life includes, things that could be interpreted as such. It's not a sex cult. I mean, it's you don't get together and cavort like a Hollywood party, kind of thing. Your sex life is completely your own and your own business, and any application that you would do, it's just like the tantric yoga. It's sex magic is
right.
in a way the Western the Western Tantra yoga, and there's very few knowledgeable people that would even suggest that the study and the practice of Tantra yoga is perverse or pornographic or dangerous or licentious. Same way with sex magic. The point is, what's keeping the stars lit, what's keeping the universe going, what caused the Big Bang, which is what's the mechanics that's responsible for the creation and the sustaining and the destruction of the universe, is as sexual in nature, in a metaphoric way, as anything. Sex is a great metaphor for existence, the nature of being itself. And so the point is, Crowley was bold enough. He thought outside the box enough, if you will, in a Victorian age, and where you could even writing about sexual matters could land you in prison. In an environment like that, Crowley was bold enough to say, look, we all understand what sex is about, what the drive is, what the union of male and female, what the creative process is, what the instincts, what the drives are, what the polarity is involved in gender and such. That's all a metaphor for the creative process of the universe. And he was bold enough to go ahead and overtly display these metaphors by discussing them in sexual terms whenever he could. When he couldn't overtly discuss them in sexual terms, he did something even bolder. He discussed them in terms of blood sacrifice, and because you could talk about blood sacrifice, but you couldn't talk about sex.
Why do you think there's such a discrepancy there?
What's that?
Why do you think that there's...
Yeah, it's so perfectly Victorian oxymoron that you could write all about a ritual where you sacrifice a human being and
that's just okay.
That's okay, but you can't talk about making love to somebody that you adore and lose your sense of separateness and ecstasy. You can't talk about that. So that's another thing Crowley did that really did not help his reputation, because he would for people that knew what he was talking about, it was almost comically explicit. Okay, but if you didn't know what he was talking about, it sounded like, oh my God, this man must be just killing thousands of babies every year, you know? And people still believe he killed thousands of babies every year, which is absolutely absurd. Crowley was never even charged with the crime of jaywalking in his life. So,
well, I think a lot of that's been kind of promoted by, I don't want to say churchgoers, but the institutional religions who have used, the inability or the seeming lack of knowledge in the general populace, their lack of knowledge on what we call the secret teachings, and they don't really understand, so the church is able to paint this picture, especially like they did with the pagans, where they're able to demonize those gods, for example, taking the symbology of the horns and placing them on the devil to demonize those, such as the Templars, they claim that were worshiping the devil, or Baphomet, the horned goat god Mendez, things like that. And when I see, or when I think about sex magic, there's still a part of me culturally, socially, in the Western world that I immediately think, or at least sacrifice, the exact thing that you're telling me, that, oh my God, they must be sacrificing hundreds and hundreds of people. But that's not necessarily the case. When I think of sex magic, I think of the unification into producing a third, the Trinity, if you will, the divine Trinity. Things like that come to my mind.
Yeah, believe me, my wife wouldn't let me belong to a sex cult. I'm not allowed to do that. I've been married 47 years, so yeah. But in a way, if you're still that childish, that frightened, and I'm not saying this unkindly, but if you're still that ignorant, okay, maybe you need to not get into this kind of stuff anyway, okay, or yet.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's one would think that magic is the heights of superstition. It isn't. A superstitious magician isn't even a magician, okay? And the idea of even getting into scratching the surface of the outer husk of magic, while you're still a fearful and superstitious, frightened and ignorant person, is just asking for your mental illness to be exacerbated. Okay, it will amplify your existing pathologies, and so magic isn't for everyone. It really isn't for everyone. It's for people who have at least freed themselves from the dualistic trap that most of the world's religions for the masses like to keep their flock locked into. Okay, it's really hard to control the thoughts and actions of a bunch of magicians. They're all okay. It's like you can't really bamboozle a room full of Merlins. You can't put them in a herd mentality. And
how do you see, if you were able to describe the term magic? I mean, we have an association with the term like that from what we see in movies and television, what we read in books. The same thing with the word occult. How do you describe those to the layman? Is there a way to, or is that another one of those things where they have their interpretation, but we have a different interpretation, and some people are just not ready for the truth?
Well, Crowley's definition of magic is I've yet to see one that's better, and it's just magic is the science and the art. It's two things at once. It's a science and then it's an art of causing change to occur in conformity with your will. Now that sounds really unspooky and unmystical, but it's very spooky and it's very mystical, because if you and I were sitting in a room and I asked you to pass me a bottle of water, okay, it'd be my will to have a bottle of water in my hand, okay. There's a bottle of water over there by you. I ask you to pass it to me, okay. My word, it's my will to have that water. And so I ask you, I utter the words, Ryan, would you please pass me that water? That is an incantation. It is invisible. You can't even see those words. And those words, the vibration of my will is being transferred through the vehicle of the demons of my muscles that operate my lungs and my tongue and my mouth and my lips to formulate those words. I put all of that hierarchy of natural forces, which we may as well call demons or angels or whatever we want. And that invisible incantation goes across the room and strikes your eardrums. And that message is interpreted, and then you put your muscles to work, your demons to work, to grab the bottle and pass it to me. Okay? Can you see that is magic? You can apply the metaphors of classic magic that uses incantations, prayers, supplications. I said please. It was a supplication, okay? And you responded as if you were a ministering angel responding to my incantation to refresh me with that water. Okay, all magic is just like that.
So, I mean, would you say then that our everyday reality is basically magic?
There is nothing that is not magic as long as there is somebody's will involved in it.
Yeah, see, that's a lot different for most people than what they think because they watched one of the Mummy movies or something like that, right? Right. And with those metaphors, though, are in their own way instructive and beautiful too. And that's where the art of magic comes in. Technical magics. The magician is an artist, and so they compose their incantation with great art. They set up. You've heard of the law of attraction kind of stuff. Well, yeah.
A magician really can really go all out in setting the stage properly for to put the mechanism of this law of attraction into motion, and that so magicians sometimes have exotic clothing, and they burn appropriate incense and have wonderful lighting and things like that to excite their sense of beauty, their sense of wonder, their sense of awe.
So it's like promoting an image. Does it have anything to do with a type of suspended belief in the audience?
No, well, actually there can't be an audience but yourself. In magic, true magic, you've only got one material to work with, and that's yourself. In magic, you can only change yourself. If you want to change something in the world, you change yourself so that you change that thing.
So that the world begins to mirror you.
Yes, because ultimately that's who we are. We are the big whatever it is. we're just asleep to that fact.
Right. I mean, that's the micro macrocosm, the as above, so below.
There you go. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, tell me a little bit more about your work. How long have you been writing books? I'm guessing, since you've written so many books, it's been more than a couple of years. Have you always had an interest in writing, especially about these topics? What got you into that?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing, but mostly just goofy stuff that made people laugh. And along about 1988, one of my lodge members, I have a lodge of OTO here in Costa Mesa, California, and one of my lodge members was Christopher Hyatt, the author, and he had a best-selling book out at the time called Undoing Yourself, which is still, as far as I know, bestseller. And he called me one morning and said, I want to write a book about the kind of the psychological aspects of tarot. And tarot, the tarot cards are sort of structured along the lines of the Hermetic Kabbalah. And that's sort of been my specialty and such. And
yeah, you've written some books about the tarot, haven't you?
Yes, but I hadn't at the time. I hadn't even thought about writing, and he just called me up one morning and said, I want to write this book about psychological aspects of the tarot, and it may be an exercise or two, but I don't know that much about the tarot. Would you want to help me with the book, and we can co-write this book together? And that was... Can you imagine to have kind of what it's like to have a best-selling author call you out of the blue and say, will you write a book with me? And so I said, well, I've never written a book. I don't know, I'm sure somebody else could help you do this much better.
Somebody more qualified.
Yeah. And he said, well, who? And so everyone that I wanted to refer him to were already dead.
That's not going to work.
And he waited for me to go through, the kind of the list of people that were my teachers, either directly or vicariously, and he said, well, there you go. The reason I'm calling you is because everybody else is dead. So you may not be great, but you're alive.
That's all that's left.
Yeah. And so he and I wrote, he paid me $1,200 a month, plus half the royalties of the book, which is an incredibly good writing job, especially in around 1988. Geez. And I went to his place in Long Beach 4 days a week, and he taught me the discipline of writing, and we knocked out that book. And before that book was even finished, we had a conversation about Enochian magic, the Elizabethan magic of Dr. John Dee.
Yeah.
And because of that discussion, we just as we almost finished the first book, we put that on hold. And I wrote an extended commentary on Crowley's work on the Enochian system, and we wrote this Enochian book together. And we published both of them within just a few months of each other. And so in the first 2 years of our collaboration, we wrote and published 4 books. And that got me writing books. And when he then moved to Arizona, I met with Don Weiser, and I wrote a book called The Magic of Aleister Crowley, and that seemed to sell pretty good, and there my writing career began. And I didn't know that I was a writer, but I just sort of enjoyed doing it. And since then, I've knocked all my books are still in print, still selling, and I've been very, very lucky to have. I've never had to audition a book, or I've always had a publisher ready to publish whatever it was.
What about the music?
Come up with, yeah.
What about the music? Does the music go back further than the books?
Yes, the music goes back further than the books. I moved, like every teenage boy in the 1960s. I had a band in Nebraska, and I was, again, lucky enough and so completely unaware of my own lack of talent that I almost convinced other people that I was talented. And I had this working band, and my father was very ill, and for the last 3 years of my high school years, my band helped me support the family in Columbus, Nebraska. And but as soon as I graduated from high school, I moved back to California, and immediately bumped into another songwriter, and it's a long and very interesting little story, but we ended up very shortly getting a record contract with CBS, or Columbia. Epic Records, which is Columbia, which is CBS. And so we did 2 singles and an album on Epic, and the album got the singles did pretty well. We were called Charlie D and Milo, if any of the record file people out there want to look us up and play our music. Charlie D and Milo. I was the Milo. And so we did 2 singles and an album, and that the album got Billboard magazine spotlight pick, and so neat. we did pretty well. And as a matter of fact, we were doing so well, and I was enjoying the excesses of a working kind of Hollywood musician, artist, that he was in danger of jeopardizing my stable home life, if you know what I mean. And I more or less sort of made the decision that I would rather have a stable family life. Constance and I became pregnant, and so I thought, well, I would rather raise this child in a stable environment than the environment of a Hollywood fast lane guy. And so that's what I did. I just it was a no-brainer. It wasn't a sacrifice or anything. I just stopped the music, stopped listening to music, and did what I could to keep a roof over the head of my family, and which was pretty tough, because if you're a musician, you're really not prepared for objective reality. And
you're able to express yourself artistically, I would think, in the books that you write as well.
Well, it's like my music. I just do what I have to do to get the idea out, And but I've always loved music. I've always loved words. I'm a big fan of Mark Twain, and I adore wit, and I have a Monday night magic class that Constance and I host for the last 37 years, a weekly class in our home. We had one last night, and the people that show up to this class, it's kind of a different selection of people every week, but I tell you, they're just the most brilliant, and it's such a luxury to have all these brilliant people. I don't teach the class. I just ride the thing like a mechanical bull, and but in a way, it's an organism. It's a living organism of thought and learning and inspiration. And we're just so lucky to have something like that in our lives, and it just like refreshes, it like defrags our mind every week, and it's very renewing and exhilarating.
Yeah, it sounds pretty fun too. If you're just joining us, I'm having an incredible conversation right now with Lon Milo Duquette, author of several books, including The Key to Solomon's Key. Is this the lost symbol of Masonry? One of the main reasons I wanted to get Lon on the show today. I'm your host, Ryan Gable. This is The Secret Teachings. All of his information is linked up on our website, www.thesecretteachings.info. And Lon, tell me a little bit about this book, The Key to Solomon's Key. Does this have anything to do with, say, the Harem Key book?
Indirectly, sure, yeah. And Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and any book about Templars, and any book about...
just through that stream of research.
Yeah. But I'm not, qualified to judge on how the quality of research of Hiram Key and Holy Blood, Holy Grail, because they're or the Dan Brown books and things like that. They're very interesting and fun and entertaining. But here's the story on this book. I wanted to write just a simple commentary on Solomonic magic, otherwise known as Goetia. And Solomonic magic is the type of magic where the magician stands in a protective circle, a circle protected by, divine names and things like that. And the magician evokes a spirit or a demon or a spirit into a triangle that's on the outside of the circle. And then the magician, of course, orders the spirit to go do some kind of, some form of magical heavy lifting.
Is this as literal as it sounds, or is it somewhat metaphorical?
Well, it's all metaphorical, including the literal. But no, in the medieval practice of it, that's exactly what the magician thought he was doing. Okay.
Okay.
And
I see.
okay, so I had the opportunity to write this book, so I thought I would. Okay, I'm also a Freemason. Okay, just about this time, I joined the Masons. Now, when I was a kid, I belonged to DeMolay, which is the Masonic group for young boys, usually the sons of Masons.
Yeah, it was named after Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake, right, at Notre Dame?
There you go. And so the whole little mythos around the DeMolay initiatory experience was the trial and the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templars. Okay. So I was familiar with the Templars, and I was familiar with Freemasonry and Freemasonry's preoccupation with the person of King Solomon. Now, in Freemasonry, we talk about King Solomon a lot, but we make indirect references to certain Bible passages where King Solomon appears. But most of the Masonic material and traditions that are associated with King Solomon are not found in the Bible. Okay. That being said, okay, keeping all of that in mind, I just wanted to write a little bit in the book about the historical King Solomon. That's all. I just wanted a little paragraph where I could say that, the real King Solomon, who lived between such and such years and such years, and who is buried in such and such a place, and who did such and such. I really wanted to say a little something historic about King Solomon before I started to go into all of this metaphoric, traditional, legendary stuff. So I started to investigate King Solomon. Trust me, Ryan, I just wanted a paragraph.
And you ended up with the whole book.
Yes. I just wanted a paragraph about the historical King Solomon. Long story short, I could not find one scrap of historical evidence for the existence of King Solomon. I could not find one scrap of historical evidence for the existence of King Solomon's temple. I found tons of historical evidence about what was going on in that Jerusalem area during those years that King Solomon was supposed to exist, and it had nothing to do with King Solomon or even a culture of people called ancient Israel. There was no scrap of evidence for David, King David. There was no scrap. No, in an area that has had archaeological excavations for thousands of years, where they know how many onions they paid the builders of the pyramids, where we've got belt buckles and condom wrappers from Ramses the First, there is not one thing, there's not one chariot wheel, there's not one scrap there's not one belt buckle for an army that supposedly had conquered Egypt and all the way up to Babylon. There was no evidence for ancient Israel.
So what does that exactly mean then, Lon?
That means that the entire Bible is historically neutralized.
It's kind of like mythology allegories historicized.
Right. And the idea, that it's not to say that there wasn't a thriving Jewish religion around 200 BC. The Hasmoneans, who we know as the Maccabees, were it was already going. There was this a thriving sacrificial religion going on there. But those people didn't even come back as a unified people until about 530 BC.
So maybe the Bible should be printed now with a little sticker on the front that says, kind of like a movie or a book is nowadays, based on somewhat historical fact, because some of it's realistic and some of it's just made up.
So the point is, the Knights Templar. So flat out, they're okay. And I couldn't believe that such a big story could go unnoticed. I thought I had to be missing something. But all references, all so-called evidence of Solomon and David and ancient Israel and the first temple and all of that, all of it was from the Bible. The Bible was its own book that told people it had to be believed because the book said it had to be believed. It had no collaborating evidence whatsoever. Not only that, but what archaeological evidence there was, it was completely invisible to that archaeological evidence that did exist. The point is that the story of ancient Israel was created in the 6th century BC. It was created then. There was no Moses. There was no, or at least the Cecil B. DeMille biblical King James idea of Moses and of Abraham and all of that. That was all so incredibly modern. Our grandparents could almost remember when they made this stuff up. Okay.
Well, I know a lot of this, though, goes back into cultures such as in Sumer, the stories of the Ark, for example, and the flood. Those stories go back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, the very same people and chroniclers that were responsible for writing the Bible were trying to capture about 12 small tribal people's word-of-mouth legends of the creation, okay? But the Exodus was not from Egypt. The Exodus was really talking about the relocation of the various regional tribes that Nebuchadnezzar had captured and brought their royalty back to Babylon. And then when Cyrus took over, he said, you got to get these people out of here, you know. And they weren't one people; they were like 12 people, and it was literally a matter of Zerubbabel, or the guy who we know as Ezra, going to Cyrus and saying, look, we can rid you of all of these people Nebuchadnezzar brought into Babylonian eyes. I can take them all away. I can take all 12 of these little groups away, get them out of your hair. I can convince them they are one people, and just give me a little land somewhere where I can take them and I can convince them that they're going home to where their ancestors came from. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. About 535 BC, they literally invented the religion, invented the culture, and then invented the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, right then.
Right. So, you know what, I remember, you know, from my research, and I've been doing this for coming up on 6 years now, and I bounce around from topic to topic. One of my main interests is in the work that you actually do, whether it's magic or the tarot, divination. But I've studied a lot about Hiram Abiff, and I've studied a lot about the Masons and different secret organizations, mystery schools, if you will. What I found is that when the Israelites, at least the story we hear of the Israelites coming out following Moses out of Egypt and the persecution there, the oppression, that most people don't really make the connection that when Moses came down off of Mount Sinai, they were worshiping the golden bull Apis, which was actually an Egyptian god. They were not worshiping Yahweh at the time. That wasn't until it was later created, as you're saying, in order to basically control those people, because God had told Moses and the priests to slaughter some 3,000 Israelites simply for worshiping a different God. So, it gives us a different image of who God is, or who God is, at least how we perceive him, and also the fact that this whole religion of Judaism, at least in the terms that we've seen, was not even present fully at that time.
No, and as a matter of fact, it wouldn't be present for almost another 10,000 years. That was supposed to have taken place in 12,000 BC, and or 1200 BC, and it certainly wasn't. That wasn't going on at all. Egyptians didn't own slaves. Okay, the Egyptian myth was literally a retelling of the Babylonian myth. That was something that everyone in that relocation wave could understand, because their generation had been plucked up from their various areas and taken to Babylon. The story of a more ancient Exodus was something that they could identify with. That story of the Moses and everything else, that story was written around 500 BC, 530-some BC. Okay? It wasn't written at the time of Moses. Okay? It's really quite a story, and I couldn't believe that there wasn't some kind of evidence that there was some kind of support for this, because how could all of these people be bamboozled all these years? Right. I got a hold of a guy named Thomas L. Thompson at the University of Copenhagen, and I read one of his books called Mythic Israel. And you can't believe how small the print is in that book. It's insanely small and very, very boring. And
is it a big book?
It's a little book that's so thick and so boring. But I waded through that until I found kind of what I was looking for, and I contacted him. And I said, look, am I reading this wrong, or am I safe in saying that there was no ancient Israel, no Cecil B. DeMille type ancient Israel with its headquarters in Jerusalem prior to the 6th century BC? And he said, he wrote me an email back, and the email was in the smallest font you could. I don't know how he did it, and it went on, and I scrolled on and on and on, but I got to the bottom, and he said, "Well, I guess I'm not answering your question directly." He says, "Oh yes, you are very safe with saying that. You could even push it ahead to 250 BC."
Wow, see, I never really made that connection.
Yeah. So here, I got the quote right in front of me here. I just dug it up. If you want to, in writing about the historical development of Palestine between 1250 and 586 BCE, all the traditional answers given for the origin and development of Israel have had to be discarded. The patriarchs of Genesis were not historical. The assertion that Israel was already a people before entering Palestine, whether in these stories or in those of Joshua, have no historical foundation. No massive military campaign of invading nomadic Israelites ever conquered Palestine. There was never an ethnically distinct Canaanite population whom the Israelites displaced. There was no period of the judges in history. No empire ever ruled a united monarchy from Jerusalem. No ethnically coherent Israelite nation ever existed at all in history. Neither Jerusalem nor Judah ever shared an identity with Israel before the rule of the Hasmoneans in the Hellenistic period, and that's approximately 250 BC. Now, here's my thing with the book. The Knights Templars did go to Jerusalem after the First Crusade. They were billeted on the location where supposedly King Solomon's temple, or the first temple, was supposed to have been built.
Right.
They stayed there doing nothing. They didn't go out clip-clopping on their horses, protecting anybody or fighting anybody. They stayed there, and they didn't initiate new people. They didn't do anything. They just stayed there for 9 years.
That's where they were known as the Poor Knights of Christ of Solomon's Temple, because that's where they kind of set up home, right?
Correct. Now, there is no direct evidence that these guys did a massive excavation or anything else. Okay, we don't know what they did. We just know that they stayed there for 9 years. You gotta think that they probably poked around, okay? Because what do you do for 9 years? You can't even order out for tabbouleh pizza, in those. The Knights Templars supposedly, and Dan Brown and everything else, supposedly they discovered some earth-shaking bit of evidence that would shake the Catholic Church.
Right, a type of hidden treasure.
A hidden treasure of some kind. And to tell you the truth, they probably did have something both on the church, the Catholic Church, which was the only church, and they obviously had something on the Saracens too.
Well, I think that the Templars, as dualists, they shared a lot of the same beliefs as the Gnostics did, and the Gnostics were driven underground by the church as well for a lot of their beliefs. For example, like Jesus was not physically crucified; it was a spiritual crucifixion, and
right.
So
right.
Those kinds of ideas basically eradicated the basis for the church, and those were they were dangerous teachings, and I think that's one of the reasons the Templars were expelled in 1307 from Europe. That including the fact that they had had loaned out massive amounts of money, but I think the main reason that they were expelled from Europe and went to Scotland, Portugal, and eventually the New Jerusalem here in America, at least my belief, is because of the knowledge that they had against the organized religious political institutions.
Well, that's obviously the case. And my little point is, because I'm not an archaeologist either, my point is they didn't have to find anything. Okay? They just had to not find what should be there.
And what do you mean by that?
All the Templars actually lived in the area. All the Templars had to do was talk with a few people whose racial memory included the fact that none of this stuff existed, that there wasn't a David, there wasn't a Solomon, there wasn't a Solomon's temple.
Okay, I see what you mean now.
All they had to do was poke around enough to say, gee, a foundation for such an edifice couldn't possibly exist here. They almost had to just not find anything.
Well, now on a side note, you're a Mason, right? You mentioned that a little bit ago. Well, what degree level are you?
I'm a 32nd degree Scottish Rite.
Okay, so now we had a guest on the show. His name was, I don't know, maybe Robert Sullivan the Fourth?
No, I can't say I do.
He's written a bunch of books about. He wrote one on cinema symbolism, Hollywood symbolism from a symbolic standpoint. Being a 33rd degree Mason. I think he's in the Knights Templar as well, the modern day version. But he wrote another book about Enoch, and he was talking about the Royal Arch degree of Masonry and relating that to how it was very much portrayed in the movie National Treasure. But it just makes me think, because now if you're saying that this whole thing was essentially made up, then it makes me kind of, re-question or at least rethink the stories of the Templars excavating the supposed remnants of Solomon's temple, or supposedly where Herod's temple had been at the time. Right.
So Herod's temple was truly the great temple.
What about that?
But the point in Masonry is a very big tent. Okay, and it's not like every Mason has this big secret or even gives a damn about any of this stuff. Okay, but in Masonry we are obliged to think about biblical stories in a non-biblical way. And in a way to the mindset of a very strict Christian, that's pretty heretical right there. Okay, we are Masonry's the Bible in Masonry is one of the great lights of Masonry. Okay, the square, the compass, and the Bible is one of the great lights in Masonry. And what does a Mason use light for? okay, to look for, Mason needs light when they excavate, when they look under things that are already in the dark. And when we actually use the Bible to look at the Bible, we see that it's not history. It's something else, and it could be a good something else, but it's not history. And Masons are more or less given permission to question the historicity of the Bible. And the idea that even Dad Lund, that created the Order of Demolay for these boys, the Knights Templar were charged with all sorts of nasty things, just like Aleister Crowley was,
exactly.
was accused of all of these nasty things, worshiping the devil and buggery and all sorts of just wild stuff. And but still, this knowledgeable Mason held up the idea of Demolay as a great hero, and that not only that, but at a time when Masonry was forming, right in the hot white heat of the Enlightenment in France, the French Masons were saying, "Oh boy, the Templars, we are the, if not the direct literal descendants of the Knights Templars, we're at least the heirs to their tradition of knowledge and truth making you free. We embrace the Templars as our mythical forebears." And so Masonry still has echoes of that if you know where to listen for those echoes. And that's why in the beginning of the book I talk about Masonry and my experience in Demolay, and then I set the stage for all of this. But I want you to consider this one more thing. If you'll notice that the two books of the Gospels go to great lengths to prove Jesus' genealogy through Joseph to King David. His qualifications as Messiah, his credentials as Messiah, are that he comes from the family of David, that he's a direct descendant of David.
And the term Messiah, I believe, is a term that was placed on the next ruler of Jerusalem. And once you became the next ruler, you no longer were the Messiah. I think there's been a lot of misunderstandings of the terminology.
There's been a ton of that. That's been more misused than... it's been a misused word for sure. But if we remove,
Lana, I mean, you might even put it in the book. The Mesa was actually the Egyptians used the fat of alligators or crocodiles, more so, to anoint those who were being sort of baptized. So, in terms of baptism and resurrection and the entire symbology of that gets translated through, I think, to the Messiah. A term, again, has been mistranslated. I didn't know if you had studied that or knew about that.
Well, actually not. No, I didn't.
Yeah, the crocodile fat. But I just thought that was interesting. Because I was actually going to ask you, I don't mean to divert where you were going on that course, but you mentioned like the official founding of Masonry and being a Mason and doing all of this research. Do you or do you not trace Masonry back further than that? Does Masonry come from an earlier time period?
Well, I doubt whether you could find paperwork and lodge minutes that go much further back than the 1600s, maybe 100 years prior to the formation of the Grand Lodges of England.
So at least
in 1717. So, but in movements such as this, the traditional history is just as important, or if not more important, than the technical history. And the technical history, I doubt whether we can go much further back than the remnants of the cathedral builders. But it's certainly obvious that the Templars weren't all executed, that the entire Templar fleet disappeared, and that Scotland has plenty of places to park your boat and hide out. But the point is, if you don't have King David in history, King David is like, and Solomon are like a keystone in an arch, and if you remove the keystone, one side of the keystone is the Old Testament, it falls apart, and the other side of the keystone is the New Testament with Jesus, and it falls apart. So it's a very, very dangerous idea that there wasn't a King Solomon.
Is that in relation to the twin pillars of Solomon's temple?
I don't think that's a direct correlation. That's more hermetically sound. It has more to do with magnetism than history.
Okay.
But the point is that everything that the church was trying to do in unifying an Old Testament and a New Testament, and then basing so much of it on the historicity of it rather than on the spiritual treasures in it, seems to be exactly what the freedom of thought that Freemasonry tries to engender in people, the ennobling of the human soul rather than the promotion of self-loathing that has what it's turned into. But anyway, I try to make all these points in the book, and as the book was being published, the book was already at the printers. There was Michael Woods, the British documentarian and historian, that does marvelous In Search of the Queen of Sheba and In Search of this and In Search of that. Well, he had a BBC series called In Search of the Queen of Sheba, and of course the Queen of Sheba myth goes hand in hand with King Solomon. So that's what he starts off, and I'm going, oh, damn it. He's going to pull out some piece of historical evidence, going to make my whole book fall apart. And
when it just got to the printers.
It just got to the printer. I was getting ready to say, hold the presses, they found a belt buckle. And so he goes first, in order to, we first hear about the Queen of Sheba in the Bible and where she comes to visit King Solomon. So let's look for King Solomon. And I'm going, oh, gee, here it comes, And so he goes to Tel Aviv University, and he interviews a professor about King Solomon, who's supposedly the Tel Aviv University's big authority. And he says, well, tell me about King Solomon. And he goes, and he laughs. And he goes, no. He says, not in history. And Michael Woods laughs, and he says, not in history? What do you mean by that? And he says, Solomon David, just a legend. Just a legend, no history. And I go, whew, wow. And then he goes to the University of Jerusalem, talks with another guy who's a Bible scholar. Okay, and I said, oh, okay, this guy's here we go. And he says, well, tell us about King Solomon, and tell us about the historical King Solomon. And he says, that I cannot do because Solomon did not exist in history. Okay, now, why are people killing each other over a deed of land supposedly given to them by God himself, when the whole story of the giving of that deed,
it's all made up.
Is all made up.
Exactly. That's something that I've covered on this show. I don't even know how many times, Lon, and it creates such a backlash in any community, even people that really enjoy the show and email me every week. They get very put off by that topic, and I think a lot of it has to do with what we call education, more so indoctrination, and learning, or being indoctrinated, not learning, and being indoctrinated into these ideas about World War II and what was done to the Jews over time, gaining that sympathy. I mean, obviously what you're doing here and what you did in your book, it's been out for a while, but did you get any type of like anti-Semitic backlash from any community? No.
Perhaps if the book was more popular, if it sold a few more copies, I'd probably get some backlash. But no, and as a matter of fact, I've delivered my lecture on the series to Masonic groups and Masonically sponsored lectures all over the world, and there really is no argument. You cannot argue on an empirical level the existence. A few years back, they found some kind of a clay thing that said something of the house of David, and there was a big, this finally proves that David existed. Oh boy, but it proves absolutely nothing. Okay, House of David, they use the term house in a different way. There's plenty of people named Dawood, and it's likely that all of this stuff had some sort of scrap of historical. There probably was, a tribal king of some kind that whose legend could easily be inflated into such a thing like this, But the point is, our whole idea of all of that is just not so, and it is the most dangerous secret in the world. It still is the most dangerous secret in the world. Can you imagine how upset Islamists would be, because they're based on this book too? It pulls a plug on everything.
Yeah, it just destabilizes the status quo.
Yes, and it requires a level of maturity, even in each individual, to swallow it. Okay, and you have to more or less say, is your view of God big enough to take a hit like this? Or is it so small that a small little idiot like Lon Duquette can dig up evidence that it's not so? Is it that fragile? Are you on that shaky of ground that your entire spiritual investment can be destroyed by the lack of one belt buckle? It's what it comes,
right.
What it comes right down to.
Or the intention to write one paragraph on a historical figure.
Yeah. So that's that. The name of the book is The Key to Solomon's Key, and I think it's, I'm looking right here, I got them all down. I'm looking here at 6 copies of it in 6 different languages, 7 if you count English. It is it is my most popular book internationally. It's the most.
And it's on Amazon. I know it's available through CCC Publishing as well. Anywhere else?
Right.
Barnes and Noble, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, Barnes and Noble and any place that books are sold. I'm sure you can get it at Walmart.
Yeah, I don't know about Walmart, but I mean, when I look at the cover to this, the one I'm looking at is the second edition. Is the second edition cover different than the first edition, or is it the same cover?
It's a bit different. The first edition is called Key of Solomon's Key, Secrets of Magic and Masonry, and the second one has new material and several new chapters, and it's called "Is This the Lost Key of Freemasonry?"
Okay, now here's something that's interesting. I, at least for me, for my radio show, The Secret Teachings, when I first got into these topics, couple 5-6 years ago, I had went to a bookstore because I just started buying books on the subject, and the first book I ever picked up was a book about Atlantis. And when I got into radio later on, which I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years too, the first guest I actually interviewed on the show turned out to be the author of that first book that I ever picked up to start reading on these subjects. And I've actually, in terms of your work, I've seen your book every time I've gone to Barnes and Noble. I haven't gone there much recently, but I used to go at least once a week, and I would always see it, and I always thought, I want to buy that, I want to get a copy of that, and I want to read it, and I want to have Lon on the show. And I never thought much more about it. I've known Brad Olson for a while now. I've read both of his books. I've had him on the show quite a few times. And I'm flipping through his last book, Modern Esoteric Beyond Our Senses, and boom, there's the photograph of your book again in his catalog. And I thought, you know what, I got to email Brad. And he hooked us up, and I'm really glad that he did, because this information, I think, is so vital to understanding our true history and not the mythological, made-up fantasy that some institutional sects would like us to believe. And to me, this is just another synchronicity.
Yeah, well, that's how those things work.
That it is.
Yeah. So.
Well, I really appreciate it, Lon. I've got some more questions for you if you have just a little bit more time.
Would it be possible to take a 2-minute break?
We can absolutely take a little bit of a break. Usually it's the host that wants to take the break. I always push myself right on through because I don't have commercials, but we can absolutely take a break. When we come back, we'll still be speaking with Lon Milo Duquette. He's the author of several books, 16, according to his biography, 16 critically acclaimed books. He's also a musician, and he is one of the one of the leaders of the governing officers, of the Ordo Templi Orientis. Lon Milo Duquette, right here on The Secret Teachings, our website, www.
Well, I'm interested in all sort of aspects of ceremonial magic, and I'm especially intrigued with the magic of John Dee and Edward Kelly.
Wasn't he an advisor to the royals, to Queen Elizabeth?
He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth, and he's one of the smartest guys of his day. Might have been the smartest guy of the day. And so he's a real-life historical character, much unlike King Solomon.
He actually existed.
He actually existed, and but anyway, he was just an absolutely brilliant guy. He was a magus, a Renaissance magus, and so in other words, he was like Leonardo da Vinci. He could absolutely do everything, and he was an engineer and a physician and a cartographer. He invented the charts and the navigational tools that helped England be so successful at sea, and he was an early believer in Queen Elizabeth, even before she was queen, and he was involved in the political intrigues of her administration, and he was her spy. He was the original 007. I mean, technically, literally 007. That's how he signed his dispatches to her as the Queen's Eyes, and it was 007. And he was truly England's first secret agent. And there's even at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., there's a wonderful, quite large John Dee exhibit. And so the guy was really real. And he wanted to, because he was such a famous mathematician and a published mathematician, they still teach his commentaries on the propositions of Euclid in universities today. The guy was just brilliant, and it was a wildly popular book. Got translated all over Europe. He would go on book tours and lecture on mathematics. He was like a rock star, an international rock star, a mathematical rock star. Girls would throw their mathematical panties on the stage at him when he spoke, and so he could travel all over Europe and get invited to the various courts of the crowned heads of Europe, and all of them wanted him to stay and teach at their own universities and stuff. So, in other words, he moved with the highest echelons of the geopolitical world of his day. It made him the perfect candidate to be a spy. And he did spy for Elizabeth, and he loved doing it, and he got a kick out of doing it. But he wanted to spy more efficiently and more conveniently remotely. He wanted to remote view. He wanted to sit in his home and look into a black mirror or a crystal ball and magically spy on the crowned heads of Europe. And to him, it didn't seem unscientific.
Well, kind of like remote viewing or something a little bit different?
It's pretty much exactly like remote viewing. Okay, that's kind of what was in the back of his mind. And to him, it wasn't unscientific. And unlike most of us today, he had a literal view of he took the Bible as history and literally true. So he thought, well, if Enoch could talk with angels and Ezra and all these other Bible characters, if they could talk directly to God's angels, so can I. And he said, they got nothing on me. They're morons compared to me. That's what he. And so he set to work scientifically to contact angels for the purpose of spying for Elizabeth. And it's a terribly long story. I wrote a book called Enochian Vision Magic, where I give my strange Duquette view of how it happened, how it all came down, but it required him to use the services of a psychic, and he teamed up with this guy named Edward Kelly.
Edward Kelly, yeah, I was just thinking about that.
And Edward Kelly was both of these guys are characters worth writing a whole book on. Okay,
Kelly was a psychic, wasn't he?
He was very psychic, okay, and he was not in the same class category as Dee. He was very working class and kind of a scoundrel, and if he had a chance, he'd be a very unscrupulous person. But there's no way that he could be as unscrupulous as what was going to happen to him. He was insanely psychic. And between his psychic right hemisphere and Dee's incredibly genius left hemisphere, they made one giant brain that seemed to make contact with spiritual intelligences of of vastly and profound order. And in a 3.5-year period, in what started out as an attempt to spy for Queen Elizabeth, they more or less tapped into the intelligences that could explain how the entire universe was created from Big Bang to now, and how they could literally communicate with different natural forces, and receive communications in visions. It's wild. Okay, it really is wild, and it's the most documented magical operation in history. Most of the critical notes, indeed took many notes in multiple folios. They're at the British Museum, they're at the Ashmolean Museum, and scholarship on that material has never been more eloquently scrutinized as it is right now. And the story just keeps getting more breathtakingly interesting with every day that new research turns stuff up. And it's a magical practice that anybody can do in their own little way almost immediately. And like I said, that was the first book that Christopher Hyatt and I actually finished and published. It was called The Enochian World of Aleister Crowley, because Crowley was extremely interested in Enochian magic.
Have you ever tried to contact some other type of spiritual entity yourself?
Oh, all the time. Yes, of course. I mean, it's I am so lazy, and that I don't really study stuff that I don't want to practice. If I can't apply it to my own work, I don't get too interested in it. I'm not a theoretical magician.
Maybe instead of being lazy, maybe it's just more efficiency.
Well, who knows what it is? The point is that I'm a passionate student when it's something that I'm engaged in, and I'm a terrible student if it's something that I don't think is ever going to apply to my own life or my own work.
A lot of the work that we've been talking about today, a lot of the history, especially talking about Israel, the formation of a lot of these myths, Moses and things like that. You know, Moses even goes back to King Sargon of Akkad, who was also placed into a reed basket and raised by a royal family. A lot of this is just a repeat of the same story. From my understanding, even in terms of the origins of Masonry, maybe not the modern-day lodges or paperwork, as you mentioned, or the proverbial belt buckle, but it goes back much, much further into different stories and different understandings of the way in which the world worked, the different sects, the secret teachings, basically, is I think what I'm trying to get at. And a lot of that in terms of, talking about how Solomon is not an actual historical person, it reminds me a lot of things such as astrotheology and relating the movement of the planets to that of physical occurrences here on Earth, and forming a lot of these religions and the religious institutions around, or at least taking the true secret teachings, those teachings of the pagans or the teachings of the ancient mystery schools, demonizing them and then distorting them for power and control socially. But when we look back in our history, all I see is just story after story after story, and distortion after distortion after distortion. What's one of the ways that we can begin to see through that distortion and begin to see things for what they really are?
First of all, start trusting your own common sense. Okay, I'm not trying to brag at all. I'm not bragging at all. Like I say, I'm the laziest thinker I know. But as a child, when I heard the stories, when I heard Bible stories, when I even heard about Jesus' miracles and things like that, when I heard that I needed to be saved because of I was born, that just the act of me being born, the fact that I was born meant that I was a sinner, and that I was unless I did something to fix it, I was going to be in painful, nightmarish hell for eternity. I instantly said to myself and to my parents and to the Sunday school teachers, that's BS. Okay, excuse me. I even as a child, I said, you can't possibly believe that.
I mean, shame on you for being born. You're already a sinner.
Yeah, and you know, they throw that right back at me, and I go, what? You know, that's, excuse me, I don't know what it is I do believe, but I do know that that's BS. Okay.
It is. It's absolutely BS. I mean, all you have to do is be able to think somewhat critically, have common sense.
So the point is, feel free to trust your own humanness. Feel free to trust your own instincts when something is amiss, doesn't seem right. And learn that it's okay when you rebel against having to believe something because someone or some book told you it must be believed. Okay, we've got everything we need to see through directly through everything if we just would learn to trust our own instincts when we smell a rat. And we don't have to demonize the people that are doing this. I mean, the people that told me that stuff at Sunday school were wonderful, dear, most of them. There was a couple a-holes in there that I tell you that I could. But most of them were wonderful, dear-hearted, dear-souled, well-intended people, okay? But they were perpetuating an evil. They were perpetuating such a big evil that is multi-generational. They're perpetuating an evil that's responsible for the death and the untimeliness and of millions of our fellow creatures. It's not really funny. I'm afraid the Bible has been more responsible for the deaths of countless millions of people. And all over this book, the book that must be believed because the book tells us it must be believed. Don't you smell a rat right there? I mean, doesn't the little kid in you go, no, that's wrong. There's a disconnect there, Dad. There's a disconnect there, Mom.
Little red flag. But people have, I think most of us are predisposed to responding to authority. And when you're constantly confronted with fear, or a system of reward and punishment, if you do what we say, you do what God says, then you'll go to heaven. If you don't, then you'll go to hell, which never really made much sense to me anyway, because if the devil is opposed to God, I would feel like he might reward you and not punish you for disobeying his enemy in the sense that we're taught in school. So, things like that. It's a system of punishment and reward, and the fear is used to keep people in line. You step out of line, you're going to be completely ostracized by anybody who believes the official version of whatever is being proposed to be reality. But you know what? You're right. It just should throw up a red flag when you just should call it what it really is, and not try to create this fantasy around it just to get along with those who have the perception of power.
Well, and it's not that a great soul can't see through it and still gain enlightenment in that environment. Okay, but they have to do it totally independently. Look, Saint Francis was a Roman Catholic, okay, but he was the best goddamn Roman Catholic in the world. Okay, he had to literally make it up himself out of the materials that he had at his disposal. The same thing with other saints, especially the ecstatic ones that more or less have plugged their consciousness directly into the source. Just like the yogis would say they scientifically do, you know. I've got this song called "Bamboozled." I think you're gonna play it.
Yeah, I have it queued up.
If you can play it all the way through, it's a very short song and it's got a punchline. So, I try to interface with everybody on a personal level. Okay, I really don't care what your religion is. Really don't care what your politics are. I may disagree with both of them. Okay, but we're people. We're just one person talking to another. But to tell you the truth, we're each other. We're all everybody. We're all each other. Okay, we're just temporarily asleep to the fact that we can't help but not only being our brother's keeper, we can't help not being our brother. So what anybody does to me, they're doing to themselves, and what I do to them, I'm doing to myself. How much clearer can I get that we need to wake up to that fact? And I'm terribly optimistic. I don't know why, but I'm terribly optimistic that human consciousness is evolving for more of us to come to that realization. It may not appear in the world that's going around, the nightmare that's going on around us. But I tell you, Ryan, there's more of us having this conversation now than ever were.
I agree almost every week on the show. I've made that realization sometime again in the week, and I talk about it on the show. You're right. More and more people are beginning to at least be open to these types of conversations.
Yeah, and that's got to be a good thing. That's got to be big magic.
It does. It's a transition, and it's a transformation. It's a shifting of consciousness, almost in a way.
Yes, well, it's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is. It's a shifting. It's an expansion of consciousness. It's a step in unifying consciousness. And every time I turn on PBS and watch one of those NOVA programs about quantum mechanics and quantum theory, and I just saw one the other night it's called The Big Bang Machine. Always in the last 10 minutes of those shows, these physicists start talking like mystics. And they start talking about the transcendence of thought. They start saying that the nature of reality, the nature of being, is consciousness. Time transcending consciousness, space transcending consciousness. And they can't help but start talking like drooling mystics, because that's where this is all taking us.
That it is. It's like a full circle that I think we come back around historically, and over time we lose information, or information is hidden and oppressed, and when the time is right, that information is revealed directly or indirectly. And like we said at the beginning of the show, to bring the show full circle, just like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, some people are just not ready for it. Others might be ready for it, and they just need to take a small baby step one at a time so they can go into it as a true skeptic. And that's another thing, is people think skepticism just means, trying to disprove anything that comes into conflict with your current belief system. But a skeptic is asking questions of any and everything, and being able to do it so unbiased, and be able to understand that there's more than one, there's more than two, there's more than three interpretations to the things that we study and the things that you write about in terms of magic and in terms of the occult and divination and symbols and the history, you say, of Solomon. You say Solomon to most people, they think, well, he existed. Well, why did he exist? It has to do with the Bible. He must be real, because they tell us he must be real, that kind of a whole thing. But anyway, Lon, I really appreciate you joining me on the Secret Teachings today. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say? I'll give you the floor for just a moment.
Well, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to ramble on like this, and hope that sometime in the future you find some material you want to talk about again.
Absolutely. This is probably some of my favorite material to discuss. This is basically, it's the foundation of the Secret Teachings, and that's why the show's named The Secret Teachings, named after Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Our guest today, Lon Milo Duquette, the author of several books, including The Key to Solomon's Key. He is currently the Ordo Templi Orientis' United States Deputy Grand Master. And the last thing I want to ask you, Lon, is the music. Anywhere the listeners can get that? Is it on iTunes? Is it
Oh, yes, it's on iTunes, Spotify, and Amazon.com. And CD Baby.
All right.
So yeah, it's where music is sold. So if you just go to Lon Milo Duquette and CD Baby, you can even get it on Amazon.
Well, I'll tell you what, Lon, send me a link to where the listeners can get the music, and I'll put it right up on the website, www.thesecretteachings.info, so they'll have an easy link to it. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I'll do it right now.
All right, fantastic. The first song we played when we first came in with Lon was called Outside the Box. This song is called Bamboozled, our guest today. And stay with us just one moment, Lon, off air. Lon Milo Duquette, author of The Key to Solomon's Key. This song, Bamboozled. I'm your host.
Lose your sense of separateness and ecstasy. You can't talk about that. So that's another thing Crowley did that really did not help his reputation, because he would, for people that knew what he was talking about, it was almost comically explicit. Okay, but if you didn't know what he was talking about, it sounded like, oh my God, this man must be just killing thousands of babies every year, And people still believe he killed thousands of babies every year, which is absolutely absurd. Crowley was never even charged with the crime of jaywalking in his life. So,
well, I think a lot of that's been kind of promoted by, I don't want to say churchgoers, but the institutional religions who have used the inability or the seeming lack of knowledge in the general populace, their lack of knowledge on what we call the secret teachings, and they don't really understand, so the church is able to paint this picture, especially like they did with the pagans, where they're able to demonize those gods, for example, taking the symbology of the horns and placing them on the devil to demonize those, such as the Templars, they claim that were worshiping the devil, or Baphomet, the horned goat god Mendez, things like that. And when I see, or when I think about sex magic, there's still a part of me culturally, socially, in the Western world that I immediately think or at least sacrifice, the exact thing that you're telling me, that, oh my God, they must be sacrificing hundreds and hundreds of people. But that's not necessarily the case. When I think of sex magic, I think of the unification into producing a third, the Trinity, if you will, the divine Trinity. Things like that come to my mind.
Yeah, believe me, my wife wouldn't let me belong to a sex cult. I'm not allowed to do that. I've been married 47 years, so yeah. But in a way, if you're still that childish, that frightened, and I'm not saying this unkindly, but if you're still that ignorant, okay, maybe you need to not get into this kind of stuff anyway, okay, or yet.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's one would think that magic is the heights of superstition. It isn't. A superstitious magician isn't even a magician. Okay, and the idea of even getting into the scratching the surface of the outer husk of magic while you're still a fearful and superstitious, frightened and ignorant person is just asking for your mental illness to be exacerbated. Okay, it will amplify your existing pathologies, and so magic isn't for everyone. It really isn't for everyone. Well, it is, but that's more or less a collateral perk of OTO study. It's to engage the individual in a unique, and I mean unique to each individual program of willed evolution, if you will. That's what initiation is generally. We could call it willed evolution, and so it's to engage on a program to help each individual discover what their particular will is, and then do whatever they can to help them achieve, to accomplish that will. It's sort of subtle in a way, in so much that we more or less come in with the premise that we wouldn't even be here. Each of us wouldn't even exist. We wouldn't be sitting here sucking breath if there wasn't something in the universe left undone that only we can do. And that and each individual has that one thing that they need to do, that they're here to do, that's their will to do, in the same unstoppable way that the orbit of a planet, or the trajectory of the sun, or the movement of the stars within a galaxy. We're no different than those natural monads of consciousness. And so the magic of the OTO is not so much involved with certainly not pulling rabbits out of a hat, or not cursing people, or doing spells. To do the magic of the OTO is to systematically raise our own consciousness to as high as states that we are capable of achieving within this life. And so that's basically it. And Crowley had all sorts of techniques, and and all sorts of different things, some more successful than others, but his writings are not only technically interesting, they're many of them are breathtakingly inspirational, and and in my opinion, put a lot of his writings on the same level as the ecstatic Christian saints, or the Rumi, or any of the other ecstatic saints of history. So it's occupied me for the last 40 years. So.
Well, Crowley's work, I know that he wrote a lot about sex magic, and when people hear something like that, they tend to think it's pornographic. What is sex magic?
Well, a lot of people are really disappointed when it's not like that.
Yeah.
Like the Tom Cruise movie, Eyes Wide Shut. They think, I became a member. I joined. I became interested in ceremonial magic and the works of Aleister Crowley back when I was about 23, 24 years old. And I was lucky enough to come into contact with a couple of Crowley's old students. Crowley died way back in 47, and he just had a terrible reputation. And talk about outside the box. He was so outside the box that there was you really had to be a brave soul to get deep enough into Crowley to see what a brilliant guy he was, and he was the type of guy that if you were superstitious and frightened enough to be scared by him, then he didn't want you studying his stuff anyway. So he just cultivated a very, very sort of black magician.
Kind of a persona go ahead.
Yeah, you got it. And he cultivated that just so that the people that were really on the ball were the only ones that actually started to kind of get him. But it's the same problem like Jung had, and it's the same problem that Nietzsche had, and things like that. And so, but I was lucky enough to come into contact with a couple of his old students that studied with him when he was alive, and they sort of disabused me of all of the nonsense that surrounds his reputation, and they were just in the process of resurrecting his occult order, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which had gotten down to just them, just a handful, maybe 6 living members left. And they
wow, just that small, Hunk. We've covered the OTO on the show before. We've talked a lot about magic, and I've always had a big interest in Aleister Crowley. Of course, when you have a reputation and a name, known as the Beast, that kind of deters, I think, people a little bit.
Yeah, it does, and it probably always will. But the order had just gotten down to. I think at the time 6 living members, all from the old days, and so I was lucky enough to be among the first that they initiated. And as it stands now, they of course have long passed away, and as it stands now, I'm the oldest, or I'm the longest. I've been a member of the OTO longer than any other living person. Okay, I guess we can put it that way, and there's no virtue to that except I just got here because other people died.
What's the main? I guess from somebody who's in the OTO, what's the main goal of the OTO? Is it to study ancient wisdom? To the show, Lon. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Ryan. How are you?
Very good. I like this song. I still have it playing in the background. I know you can't hear it. You've got an assortment of CDs, don't you? You've done a lot of music as well as writing.
Yes. Well, I just sort of write, and sometimes that's books, and Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's screenplays. But the last few years, last 5 or 6 years, I really picked up the songwriting end of things again. That's what I did when I was a younger man, and I've been enjoying myself musically, and but it's all just sort of just another outlet for whatever my creative juices that need to flow.
Are all the songs about being outside the box, stepping outside the box?
Well, in a way they are. But they're not overtly magical per se. The biggest magic in the universe is love, and a simple love song can be as profoundly spiritual and magical as anything else that you could do to try to be magical. So I write an assortment of songs. The newest album is called Gentle Heretic, and it's a collection of some of my more edgier, and if you're too sensitive, might be offensive songs, but they're really not meant to be.
No, the truth seems to be offensive, though, Lon, to people who have this preconceived notion of what should be. They're taught what is instead of what is possible, what could be. You're put into this box from the time that you're born. You're taught what is considered to be right and wrong. And if you step outside that box, you're automatically ridiculed by reflex action by the social status quo of our society. And
that's for sure.
It prevents us from being able to truly evolve spiritually and intellectually.
Yeah, so that was a pretty good choice of my songs to play there for your bumper, because my whole life, my whole career, my whole focus has been sort of thinking outside the box, and both socially, politically, spiritually. I've just been a wild, crazy kid. Now I'm a 66-year-old wild, crazy kid.
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can you pronounce it correctly for me, or did I say it right?
Well, I like to hear it said Lon Milo Duquette.
Duquette.
Yes.
Okay, Lon Milo Duquette. I just want to get that cleared up to start out.
Well, thank you.
So also, I was reading obviously your biography. I didn't realize this until I read your bio on a couple of different links that you had sent me. All of that, including where the listeners can get copies of your books, all available at www.thesecretteachings.info. But you're actually one of the governing officers of the Ordo Templi Orientis.
Yes, I'm going to join the OTO and it's sex magic and stuff. No, it's not pornographic unless your own personal sex life includes, things that could be interpreted as such. It's not a sex cult. I mean, it's you don't get together and cavort like a Hollywood party, kind of thing. Your sex life is completely your own and your own business, and any application that you would do, it's just like the tantric yoga. It's sex magic is
right.
in a way the Western the Western tantra yoga, and there's very few knowledgeable people that would even suggest that the study and the practice of tantra yoga is perverse or pornographic or dangerous or licentious. Same way with sex magic. The point is, what's keeping the stars lit, what's keeping the universe going, what caused the Big Bang, what's the mechanics that's responsible for the creation and the sustaining and the destruction of the universe, is as sexual in nature, in a metaphoric way, as anything. Sex is a great metaphor for existence, the nature of being itself. And so the point is, Crowley was bold enough. He thought outside the box enough, if you will, in a Victorian age, and where you could even writing about sexual matters could land you in prison. In an environment like that, Crowley was bold enough to say, "Look, we all understand what sex is about, what the drive is, what the union of male and female, what the creative process is, what the instincts, what the drives are, what the polarity is involved in gender and such. That's all a metaphor for the creative process of the universe." And he was bold enough to go ahead and overtly display these metaphors by discussing them in sexual terms whenever he could. When he couldn't overtly discuss them in sexual terms, he did something even bolder. He discussed them in terms of blood sacrifice, and because you could talk about blood sacrifice, but you couldn't talk about sex.
Why do you think there's such a discrepancy there?
What's that?
Why do you think that there's...
Yeah, it's so perfectly Victorian oxymoron that you could write all about a ritual where you sacrifice a human being and
that's just okay.
That's okay, but you can't talk about making love to somebody that you adore and